This amendment has been at the center of most of our constitutional debates, most of our important constitutional issues over the past 150 years, but there has been no stability in our understanding of what this amendment actually means. So the amendment, on the one hand, has been very important, but at the same time, it has not been well understood. This is not a good situation for the country to be in. My goal here is to attempt to make the meaning of the amendment clearer than it has been by sharing with you some of the research that I've been doing on the amendment and its prehistory, some of which will eventually show up in that book that Professor Dyer mentioned to you. What I believe I'm going to do, or certainly what I'm going to try to do, is to make clear the meaning of the amendment as those who wrote it understood it. Now, my main thesis is that the meaning of the amendment falls into place once we see it as a completing of the Constitution. But to do that, I have to start by speaking about the way in which the original Constitution was incomplete. So let me start there. Now, the individual who most vehemently declared the original Constitution incomplete was none other than James Madison, who is normally thought of as the father of the Constitution. He saw some serious birth defects in his child, and in fact, he did not expect it to survive its infancy. Now, in order to make clear why Madison thought the 1787 Constitution incomplete, I have to introduce a technical term, so bear with me. It's not too technical, but it's a technical term. Corrective federalism. Corrective federalism. Madison thought the Constitution was a failure because it did not embody to a sufficient degree what we can think of as corrective federalism. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. Let me start with the idea of federalism itself. I think most of us have some idea of what federalism is and of the Constitution as a federal arrangement. Basically, it's a federal system because it has two levels of government, one level being the state governments and the other being the federal government, or as they sometimes called it, the general government. Each level has its own government, constituted more or less independently of the other government, acting quite independently of the other level of government, and each has its own defined powers. Each level of government, most interestingly and most innovatively from in the original Constitution, acts directly on its own citizens without the intermediation of anybody else. Now, the key to making this kind of system work is the way in which the powers are divided between the two levels of government. So in the U.S. Constitution, we have Article 1, Section 8, which identifies those powers that belong to Congress, and the understanding is that all other powers which governments possess in the U.S. belong to the states. So, for example, Congress is given the power to regulate commerce among the states, it's given the power to declare war, coin money, punish piracy, things like that. Now, Madison thought that the federal system, as I've just described it, and which is in fact embodied in the Constitution, was good. He was the inventor of it, so he had some pride in it. But he also thought it was insufficient. In addition, he thought we needed to have this thing I'm calling corrective federalism. And in order to make clear what he meant by this idea of corrective federalism and why he saw it to be so important, I have to take one step further back with you to bring out the chief problem that Madison thought needed solving and which the Constitution of 1787 did not solve. Now, I think we all, or most of us anyway, those of us who have studied any political science or history know that Madison and others of the founders thought that the Union under the Articles of Confederation was too weak and that it needed to be strengthened. That happens to be mostly true, that piece of information that we all carry around with us, but it was not entirely true of Madison himself. He believed that the greatest problem facing America politically actually was misgovernment within the states. The states, he thought, passed unjust laws, they passed too many laws, and they changed their laws too frequently. The greatest need, he thought, was to find a way to improve government in the states. And in particular, to improve government in such a way that will better protect the rights of individuals within the states. And this is important because most of the governance in America then, not quite now, but then, occurred in the states, and the states had custody, dealt with almost all issues involving the rights of individuals. So most governance occurred in the states, and as Madison saw it, it was bad governance. Now, prior to Madison, the dominant view in America was that the one thing needed to produce just and good government was to keep the government safely in check. That is, mostly through empowering the people to control the governors. Empower the people to control the governors. That was the main idea prior to Madison. Madison is famous for rejecting this view, and if any of you have read Federalist Number 10, he makes this argument there. The simplest way to put Madison's argument, I think, is to point to his observation that empowering the people really means, in practice, empowering the majority of the people. Because every society has divisions of various sorts. What the other Americans were speaking of as the people was merely an abstraction, didn't correspond to any actual reality in political life. So once he recognized that the effectual truth of empowering the people was empowering the majority, Madison realized that the people, that is to say majorities, can be just as oppressive and just as unjust as ruled by any other small group or by a king or by a tyrant. And so Madison diagnoses, one might say discovers, the problem of majority tyranny. Now, starting with that insight about majorities, Madison came to see that the requirements of a right-securing republicanism were far more complex than merely assuring community control of the government or of the governors. And here, if you look at the third item on your handout, I'm going to give you a quotation by Madison, which is simplified and made intelligible. In government, he said, is such a modification of the sovereignty as will render it sufficiently neutral between the different interests and factions so as to control one part of the society from invading the rights of another, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to the whole society. And if you notice, I've restated that on this sheet as saying the two things required by government. On the one side, neutrality or disinterest, that is, that the government not be captured by any of the factions or groups within society, including not be captured by the majority. And on the other hand, that it be safe or controlled by the people. Now, these requirements are very difficult to achieve, especially difficult to achieve together. Because the two elements of this desideratum point in opposite directions. On the one hand, government must be neutral vis-a-vis the interests in society so that it can act disinterestedly, as he puts it, and control those interests rather than to be controlled by some of them. This requires a certain distance or independence from the society, a certain distance or independence from the society so that the elements in the society cannot impose themselves on the government and capture the government, in effect, and make it do what they want. On the other hand, though, desideratum number 2, the government must be controlled by the society and therefore must remain dependent on the society. Keeping the government under control of the society so that it does not, i.e. the government does not rule contrary to the interests of the entire society. Keeping the government on a short leash, as they like to think of it, could prevent it from developing and pursuing an interest separate from that of the entire community. Hereditary monarchy, on the other hand, could supply the other requirement. The king or the prince who is not dependent on the forces in society for either achieving office or exercising his powers, is free to be neutral or disinterested vis-a-vis the interests in society. The king stands above all those interests in society, is not captured by them, or in a way can avoid being captured by them, can be neutral or disinterested relative to them. But just as the king is free to disregard the particular claims of any faction within the society, so he also is free to disregard the interests of the whole society as well. So according to Madison, neither the republic nor the monarchy satisfies the requirements that he sees governments must try to satisfy. But he saw that historically, again, there had arisen a solution in a combination of those two regimes, of the republic and the monarchy. A limited monarchy, like Britain was, combines the two forms. We have a hereditary monarch and an elected, responsible to the people, legislature. The king supplies neutrality, and the legislature supplies the safety or control for society as a whole. And if you look at item D on the handout, it indicates the way in which this works in the British limited monarchy model. Parliament, the elected body, a republican body in effect, has a positive legislative power. It has the power to legislate. The king has a negative legislative power, or a veto. And the king can use the veto to prevent oppressive or unjust legislation that the parliament might pass. Now, Madison saw that the British Constitution could be a model for a solution to the problem of rights protecting within the states. He saw the solution in a combination of the large and the small republics in the new kind of federal system that he advocated. And here's where I'm going to try to lay out some thoughts about Madison that perhaps you've not heard of before, because they're relatively unknown. They don't make it into the normal textbooks. So in the new kind of combination that Madison actually wanted for America, what he tried to get accepted in the Constitutional Convention, the large republic, which is established in Congress, is formed to supply the disinterest, the neutrality, and the distance from society characteristic of the monarchic element in that British model. Madison assumed, actually he didn't just assume it, he had an argument for it, but I'm not going to go through that with you. Let's say Madison believed that the majorities that typically conform in a large republic will be different in character from those that exist in a small republic, less likely to fall prey to majority tyranny. Majorities in the large republic are more likely to serve the common good and to respect the rights of all. They are more likely to mimic the neutrality and disinterest of the hereditary monarch. In the limited monarchy, this monarchic element exercises its role solely through a negative power. It doesn't have a positive legislative power, it has a negative legislative power. It can say no to what other people are proposing. The Republican legislature, Parliament, possesses all of the positive legislative power. Now, the balance between the two institutions and the powers that they each possess secures, Madison thought, that combination of the two requirements that seemed so difficult to achieve, that is, combining dependence and independence. In the American federal system, this is how Madison adapts that model. In the American federal system, Madison envisaged that same combination of structures and powers, but in this case with the government of the extended republic, as expressed in the federal government, acting in place of the prince or the king, and the state legislatures acting in place of Parliament. If you look at item E on the handout, you'll get a very brief statement of the way Madison saw this working. That the states would have the positive legislative power to govern in the states with regard to most of the issues, most of the items of governance that were left to the states under the Constitution, and that the general government, Congress, would have a negative legislative power, I should say. That is, what Madison wanted to be in the Constitution was that Congress would be given the power to veto all laws passed in the states. Think about that for a minute. Just as the president has the power to veto laws passed by Congress, Madison had in mind that Congress would have the power to veto laws passed by the states. And that combination of positive legislative power in the state legislatures and this negative power in Congress would produce that same combination of interest and disinterest, of dependence and independence that the limited monarch did. Through the exercise of this veto power, the large republic, together with the small republic of the states, could achieve these two desiderata, these two elements of one desideratum, as well as the limited monarchy could, but it would have the advantage, in Madison's mind, of doing so in a wholly democratic manner. That is, all parts of it would be democratic now instead of one element monarchic. This is a system I am calling corrective federalism. It is a system of federalism because the two levels of government are each to have their own sets of powers, and most of the ordinary day-to-day governance is to occur in and by the states. It is a corrective federalism, however, because the general government, Congress, would be armed with this very large negative or veto power, which could be used to correct unjust and otherwise bad laws that are passed in the states. So in a word, Madison saw federalism as the solution to the problems of right securing that could not be solved in any other manner. The Constitutional Convention, as you might have guessed already, did not agree with Madison on this, and they did not adopt this procedure. Can you imagine if we had to wait for Congress to veto all the laws in the states? They can't even do the things they're supposed to do. So the Constitutional Convention produced a draft constitution that was a mere shadow of what Madison thought was actually needed. He thought it was therefore radically incomplete because it lacked the one thing that he thought could solve the greatest problem, that problem, again, being of majority tyranny. Because the Constitution failed to incorporate this corrective federalism idea, Madison predicted in a letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson, just as the convention was breaking up, that this Constitution would not last very long. And we had a civil war not too long after, so he was pretty right on that. All right, so now Madison failed to embody his version of corrective federalism in the Constitution, but, here I'm getting finally to my point, after the Civil War, the Republicans who controlled Congress faced themselves with massive evidence of the failure of the original Constitution to secure rights, rediscovered corrective federalism, and proceeded to plant a very robust version of it in the Constitution in the form of the Reconstruction Amendments, most especially of the 14th Amendment. The idea of a corrective federalism not only makes sense of the text and the history of the 14th Amendment, but it gives us real insight into the overall character of the amendments, of those Reconstruction Amendments added to the Constitution after the Civil War.